Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. As we enter the second half of 2022 with the latest explosion of cases from the most recent COVID-19 Omicron mutations, along with the masking requirements being changed and folks getting their vaccinations, our communities are still struggling to deal with the health, economic, mental, and societal impacts of the ongoing global pandemic. This all adds to the ongoing uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics of the pandemic that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
There's a couple things that we found in our reporting. I think the first one that stood out to me is, unlike some other cities, which we'll talk about later, San Francisco, the city government is not pushing for these downtown office to housing conversions. The mayor's office is still trying to get businesses back. They're launching all of these campaigns to incentivize workers coming into the office. And when we talked to the planning department, what we found is that it's actually not going to be that difficult to make these conversions. So it's not the city's planning processes that are actually standing in the way. It feels a little bit more like a willpower problem, at least from the bureaucracy side.
This is part 3 of our 3 episodes exploring how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting San Francisco's downtown neighborhood and economy, along with the efforts to address the issues and to reinvent downtown San Francisco. As downtown San Francisco continues to struggle to come back from the pandemic, one of the ideas that is being discussed is to convert office buildings into housing to address San Francisco's decades-long affordable housing crisis. We wanted to dig deeper into this idea of converting offices into housing and explore all of the issues of making this happen in San Francisco, along with examples of other cities who have actually converted offices to housing. Our guests also tell us about the state of California's pressure on San Francisco's government to build more housing, since according to California's Department of Housing and Community Development, San Francisco is the slowest jurisdiction in the state to move housing projects to construction. In this episode, we feature the voices of 2 local reporters, Sarah Wright and Kevin Trong from the San Francisco Standard, who've done in-depth reporting on the office building to housing conversion efforts, along with issues facing our housing and business sectors. I'm joined remotely by the housing and transportation reporter at the San Francisco Standard, Sarah Wright, along with small business policy and economic recovery reporter at the San Francisco Standard, Kevin Trong. Welcome to Voices of the Community, Sarah and Kevin.
Thank you
for having us.
I'd like to begin by just having each of you provide the audience a quick background on yourselves and reporters here in San Francisco and your proverbial reporting beat, which a lot of people don't realize what that is anymore, or report desk. So, Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I report on housing and transit here in San Francisco, which basically means that I'm looking at land use and how the city is deciding where things should go and how things should work and how it affects the residents. So how you get around in your day-to-day life, things like where you live and how much it costs to do all of those things.
Great. Thank you. And Kevin?
So my focus is looking at small businesses, which are the backbone of a lot of neighborhoods, a lot of cities, often the major employer in a lot of communities. What are the struggles that they're kind of going through, particularly as we look to the recovery that has happened or not happened in the last 2 years since the pandemic. And I kind of report on the business owners themselves, the folks that connect with them in the community, and the larger policymaker discussions on how to enable their success and continuing growth.
Great. Thank you. So I had both of you on the show because this is part 3 of our third story on downtown San Francisco. We just dropped a show a couple weeks back with Anna Tong, who works with you guys there on taxes, and Noah Arroyo over at the San Francisco Chronicle, who's been really following all of the various, if you will, plans, ideas, designs for trying to bring back downtown. And I really wanted to have both of you share with the audience all of your wonderful reporting on the concept that I think a lot of people see vacant buildings in downtown, and the whole concept of, we have a housing problem where 10,000 plus people are unhoused. We don't have enough housing. We have vacant office buildings. Let's magically mash them together and create housing downtown. We really need more people living downtown and make it a community, et cetera. So I'd love to have you each provide a little background on your reporting, kind of provide some context of reporting on the whole downtown or the attempts of downtown recovery, especially within the lens of housing and business and policy. So, Sarah, would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. So Kevin and I kind of kept hearing from Mayor Breed and from lots of other folks at the city this plea for businesses and workers to come back downtown. But no one really was making commitments and moves to have offices be full. And as a result of that, Kevin did a lot of reporting on small businesses that are suffering. I did a lot of reporting on transit ridership that wasn't coming back. And meanwhile, I'm reporting on San Francisco's housing crisis, which is ongoing, and our current need to find space to house all of our residents that live here now and our future residents. And so then this question kept crossing our desk. We were getting tweets on social media. We were getting emails. We were getting calls from people saying, why not kill two birds with one stone? Why not use these huge empty buildings to help house people in San Francisco? And they're just basically this idea that there must be a better use for that space than sitting empty.
And Kevin?
Yeah, so I'll add one other piece, which was the fact that it was in the cultural conversation, so much so that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos were tweeting about this issue. So if we knew that people of that sort of ilk were talking about it, we knew this was a conversation that was happening on our local community, or something that we were hearing on a day-to-day basis. And honestly, somewhat selfishly, I used to work downtown, and going back and forth from downtown during the pandemic was really sad. So I also had the kind of optimistic hope, but maybe we could sort of figure out what the solution could be. And part of what we do is sort of delve into those questions and actually try to answer what that might look like to enliven and enrich that area again. So that was where we kind of started our reporting from.
Thank you. Good context. And I'd like to step back a little bit further, only because in pre-pandemic times, I'd love to have you kind of share with the audience a little bit of, as much as you can, the context of what downtown dynamics were, right? And still are, which is high commercial rents, high crime, which is kind of floated back in, high taxes, the homeless issue, safety issues, which have now been accelerated. So we had that, if you will, pre-pandemic. Then the pandemic basically takes all of those elements along with others and accelerates it. So, Kevin, why don't you start and provide a little bit of, if you will, framing, set the table for us on what it was like pre-pandemic in downtown.
Right. So, I mean, pre-pandemic, when I worked there, especially, you had tens of thousands of people flooding in. And those issues that you mentioned were there, George, but they were papered over by that population. It was hard to kind of see the issues around homelessness, around public safety, when you had so many people walking around. You had a kind of critical mass. And the issues around high commercial rents and kind of that stuff was papered over by the really enormous economic growth that San Francisco has seen over the past decade. Prior to the pandemic, everything was up. And when COVID hit, I think it really highlighted some of those problems that were there kind of lurking underneath that surface.
And Sarah?
Yeah, I think what I've heard, especially from housing developers, is that San Francisco is an expensive market, but pre-pandemic, those expenses were worthwhile. It was a high cost, high reward kind of building market, and people were taking that bet. They were excited about it. And now it's been 2.5 years and people are still not back in the office in downtown. And I think a lot of developers are starting to think twice about whether that high risk is worth it.
Well, and staying with you, Sarah, why don't we segue into the findings from your reporting about the housing and transportation component?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple things that we found in our reporting. I think the first one that stood out to me is, unlike some other cities, which we'll talk about later, San Francisco, the city government is not pushing for these downtown office to housing conversions. The mayor's office is still trying to get businesses back. They're launching all of these campaigns to incentivize workers coming into the office. And when we talked to the planning department, what we found is that it's actually not going to be that difficult to make these conversions. So it's not the city's planning processes that are actually standing in the way. It feels a little bit more like a willpower problem, at least from the bureaucracy side. So Dan Sider, who is the chief for the city's planning department, said that approvals for an office to housing conversion could take a matter of months, and some of them wouldn't even require a hearing at the planning commission. It's also a process that may be easier than normal housing building of this size, simply because the building already exists, right? And so a lot of the barriers that housing developers find in San Francisco is often community opposition to a large-scale building in a neighborhood. And that can delay the process by months, even years. But because these buildings already exist, Dan said it's possible that that step of the process would actually be a lot easier than normal. So that's not really the big barrier standing in the way. I think the biggest thing that we found with this, and I've dove deeper into since Kevin and I did this report, is the cost of making these conversions. So there haven't been any applications in downtown San Francisco for this type of housing conversion. And one of the reasons for that is because it's just so expensive to make these types of conversions. So inflation is adding up here in San Francisco when it comes to building costs, and rents are steady or even down here in the city. And so across all types of housing development, builders have told me that things just aren't penciling out for them these days in San Francisco. So they are looking elsewhere outside of the city, in the East Bay, on the peninsula, where the cost is lower and the process is a bit simpler. They're deciding that it's not worth it. The other thing that Kevin and I found is that just like the city's not necessarily betting on these offices staying empty forever, neither are developers. They have a pretty long range of planning when trying to figure out where and when to build. And it's still not certain, even after 2.5 years, whether offices will be full again at some point. And so developers just aren't right now ready to bet on a future of San Francisco that doesn't have tech offices bustling downtown. And then, the other thing is that offices aren't built with housing in mind. If you think about an apartment building, every unit would have to have its own kitchen. Every unit maybe would have laundry. Every unit would maybe have a dishwasher, lots of power fixtures. At least in this kind of like modern open office style building, we don't have all of that happening. So it would take a large scale gutting of a building to actually change that infrastructure, which again would be costly. What they did tell us at the planning department is there's a type of housing that this could work for, which here in San Francisco we call group housing, which is like this dorm style, which does have communal spaces like communal kitchens, communal laundry, and even sometimes communal restrooms, which would be a better fit for this type of conversions if developers were going to go ahead with this.
Well, and staying with the idea of cost again as well, for any of the listeners and folks, I call it the magical office conversion building, which is Erickson's Emerald team converted the old AAA building on Van Ness and Fell Street into office space. And I think both of you talked to them as well. So, Sarah, do you want to share a little bit about that conversation?
Yeah, I'll let Kevin jump in as well. But the conversations that I've had with folks at Emerald and elsewhere is that the cost of building is only rising. And so that office conversion, it was complicated. I think that Oz told us that he's not even sure that it would be worth doing something like that today. It may have been the last of its kind at that price. And so that tracks exactly with what I've heard from other developers is experimental stuff isn't necessarily a good idea here in San Francisco, where it's already tremendously difficult to get projects through all of the permitting processes and then by the time you do, hopefully prices haven't risen tremendously and you can still actually physically build the housing on site.
Thank you. And Kevin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, and I actually had lunch with Oz a couple of weeks ago, and he said, forget conversion projects, no housing is basically getting built right now. If you look at sort of planning applications, they've really fallen off a cliff. And you think about the kind of macroeconomic situation when that development went through, San Francisco was on the rise, capital markets were free, interest rates were low, much easier to get a project like that financed in addition to getting it built. I mean, construction costs basically have only increased since then and have, like Sarah said, inflation has definitely added fuel to that fire. And he said that was a very special building. It was a really nice, I think the term he used was skeleton, something that really worked because of a small, narrow floor plate, which is basically the way that the building is laid out, which allowed for access to open light, which is something that San Francisco's building requirements have for these types of residential projects. And obviously, nobody wants to live in a place that's all shut in without any windows or anything like that. But it was expensive, more expensive than they initially first set out to do. But they were also in an environment where rents were high and still growing higher. So the economic sort of math made sense. A lot of times what gets built and what doesn't get built is pretty simple math. It's how much it takes to build and how much is going to come in. And if that equation doesn't balance, then that project probably won't get built.
Thank you. I want to step back just for a moment as well to provide the audience, if you will, some more context around housing. So most cities and counties have to come up with a housing element. And in that housing element, it calls for them telling the state what kind of housing in the build, how many units, where it's going to be built, et cetera. And so, Kevin, I'm going to stay with you. Just have you share with the audience a little bit about like the state, what it's calling for, which I think in your reporting is around 80,000 new units in San Francisco. And now the state under Gavin Newsom is actually pressuring cities and counties, including San Francisco, which the last I had just heard was one of the slowest counties to actually build housing in the state, to actually build 80,000 units. So would you like to walk the audience through a little bit of the policy, if you will, of housing and the requirements that the state is pushing on? And then, of course, what's the city's response?
Yeah, I can actually take this one because it's kind of the heart of what I've been working on, which is that, San Francisco has a housing crisis here. We also have a housing affordability crisis. And so we are running up against a deadline. This coming year, the state has given the city a task. We basically have to look at all of our policies, our land use policies, our zoning policies, and we have to create a plan. And that plan has to include where and how, more or less, we're going to accommodate 82,000 new units by the year 2031. And so if you do the math, like that averages out to sort of around 10-ish thousand units per year. But our housing pipeline right now, we're only building around 3,000 units per year. So we're falling pretty far short of that goal. And it doesn't look like things are going to get better soon. And the biggest share of what we're falling behind, so that goal is broken down by types of housing and their affordability levels. And we're falling short on affordable housing specifically. And so there's a lot of questions as to why this is happening. One of the main drivers, like I mentioned earlier, is the cost to build. A lot of developers are not seeing it to be worthwhile to build here in San Francisco. But the state also suspects that our processes are getting in the way of this. So they've actually opened an investigation into San Francisco's housing permitting processes. And that's because we have uniquely long permitting times. It's the highest in the state to get a project kind of through the approval process. And so one of the reasons that this might be true is because in San Francisco, we have this thing called discretionary review. And discretionary review allows any project. So if you're trying to build housing, if you're trying to add a deck to your house, if you're trying to do any number of things, those can be appealed up to a board. And so that just adds bureaucracy to the process, and it allows more time for people to basically protest this change. And so right now, in response to the state's request, San Francisco is preparing its housing element update. So this is a process we go through every 8 years. It actually the city just released a new draft and has some upcoming meetings on this process. And so we have to show the state, this is how we're going to plan for all of these new units, this 82,000 goal. And the state has to sign off on it and say, yes, this plan looks good. We think you can achieve it. And if it doesn't, then the city could actually lose out on a lot of state funding for affordable housing, which is exactly where we need more. And so the status of housing in San Francisco is such that in the last couple of decades, a lot of the building has been concentrated on the city's east side. That's where our zoning is favorable to these large scale housing projects, but it's also been favorable to things like luxury high rises because they're more profitable. But the thing is, to meet this 82,000 unit goal, San Francisco is going to have to build all over the city, and it's going to have to build different types of housing. So downtown is maybe on the table. At the end of the day, San Francisco is a 7x7 city, and there's not a lot of space. So I think what the planning department has told me is that they're exploring all options for new neighborhoods and areas to help hit this affordable housing goal, and then just our housing goals in general.
And Kevin, coming to you, you can add some more to that piece on housing, but I also, since you've been working on the whole small business climate, and we are talking about downtown, love to get your perspective on where you feel like business is 2.5 years in. We're going into the fourth quarter, which is holiday. They're trying to bring more travelers back. Just had Salesforce's largest convention that you guys reported on as well. So share with us a little bit more on both business and your take on housing.
Yeah, so I'll jump in on the housing issue. Currently, San Francisco is in a bit of a standoff with the state over control over its housing destiny. And San Francisco has had quite a lot of control over its internal housing politics and policies over the last few decades. But now we're starting to see a split, and we're starting to see the state and its new sort of housing enforcement arm really come in to play. And they kind of want to make San Francisco a bit of an example, because they sort of see it as a problem child when it comes to the need to solve the housing crisis. I was at an event with Mayor Breed a little bit earlier this week, and she said, everyone knows that there's so much unnecessary drama in San Francisco to build housing. And then she took a hit at some of her political adversaries as part of that. But I mean, you can kind of see it on the ballot in November. Prop D and Prop E are basically opposing measures that are both, quote unquote, meant to streamline the production of affordable housing and sort of remove some of what Sarah was talking about in terms of discretionary review, building affordable housing units without necessarily needing to go through all the bureaucratic hurdles. And it'll be an interesting result to see what voters want, because a lot of the problems with building housing in the past has sort of been led by the community. And now we're starting to sort of see a political divide in the city around that. And we're obviously seeing political divide in the city in terms of its leadership on that question as well. Yeah, to bring it back to business, I was at Salesforce, Dreamforce, and I think somebody described it to me like Coachella were mainly for dudes with laptops, but honestly kind of made me a little bit emotional. I was talking to some of my colleagues and friends about this because we hadn't really seen downtown like that in the last 2+ years, alive, excited, vibrant in that way. How much of that sort of filtered out to some of the surrounding small business, I think, is an open question. You had hotel rates really go up, but sort of ADR, which is average daily room rates, sort of not as high as it was in the pre-pandemic era. We had about 45,000 people attend Dreamforce earlier this year, but compared to 170,000 in kind of the pre-pandemic days. So we're still kind of getting back to it. But the problem remains. I was talking to some folks about what was the biggest weekend they'd seen since, or what was the biggest sort of boost they saw prior to Dreamforce, and they were like, oh, it was the Warriors parade. And it's like, we can't have the Warriors win the championship every week, you know what I mean? So a lot of the sort of business climate, the business activity is driven by having folks that were office workers. And if we don't have that, then we need to sort of create a center of gravity around downtown to get people there, whether that is more events, whether that is more arts displays, whether that is, in this case, actually building housing so people live in the places where they used to work.
You're listening to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. Voices of the Community is supported by a grant from the James Irvine Foundation, dedicated to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. More at irvine.org. This is George Koster, your host, and if you're just joining us, this is part 3 of our 3 episodes exploring how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting San Francisco's downtown neighborhood and economy, along with the efforts to address the issues and to reinvent downtown San Francisco. Let's get back to our conversation with San Francisco Standard reporters Sarah Wright and Kevin Trung about their reporting on converting office buildings into housing, along with examples of cities that have successfully done this and the housing and business issues facing San Francisco. Well, and staying with you, Kevin, especially within the context of business leaders, right? In the before times, we had Benioff, head of Salesforce, battling it out on Twitter with Dorsey over at Twitter, soon to be Elon Musk's new magical land, beating each other up over Twitter on housing. Where are we with our business leaders today in October 2022 to help us build, to Sarah's point, 2,000 units a year?
So I was able to catch Mark Benioff a little bit when I was at Dreamforce, and he basically said, we need more housing in downtown. And he said he was traveling around as a billionaire businessman. I guess you travel around quite a bit. So he was traveling around to the different sort of municipal business centers around the country. And he said the ones that feel alive are the ones that have a greater mix. And this is the problem that OEWD, the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, talk about is San Francisco's downtown is homogeneous. It hasn't needed to really sort of change its stripes until now. But having something so reliant on one single use is, as you can see, hits harder in these sorts of downturns. And having something with a little bit more of a mix makes it resilient. I mean, unfortunately, although there was some debate a few years back, a lot of these tech CEOs seem to be sort of pulling back or disinvesting, either from their companies or from San Francisco. So Square or Block no longer has its official headquarters in San Francisco. Its official headquarters is in the world, in the cloud, whatever. Salesforce and Mark Benioff, which has obviously a huge presence downtown in its tower, is rapidly trying to unload its office space. And he was previously one of the biggest cheerleaders for the return to work and definitely has changed his tune on that front. And now, so I mean, if I personally think, this is my own personal opinion, but if the city is going to get back into, or the city's downtown is going to get its groove back a little bit, it's going to need these sorts of luminaries and leaders to really step up and sort of make a stand and say, here, we're going to invest. Maybe we can't bring all our workers back, but we can invest in whatever the next chapter of this city is. Because to be fair, a lot of these companies started in San Francisco, were fostered in San Francisco, were sort of born with San Francisco talent and creativity and ethos. And if you're not going to invest in it when it's down, then come on, it's kind of a fair is fair. You got to help the city when it's down because it helped you kind of come up.
There's also an interesting comparison, which I've been drawing on in my reporting, which is actually South San Francisco. I know it sounds crazy. South San Francisco is way tiny compared to San Francisco, but they're what's called the birthplace of bioscience. And that has led them to be a little more durable through the pandemic. And so San Francisco may be at a disadvantage because we're over relying on these tech companies that pivoted almost seamlessly to remote work, but haven't really pivoted back yet. And it might be advisable for San Francisco to start trying to attract industries and companies like the life sciences, like research and development, like it's the peninsula and its neighbors to the south have done successfully, because those industries proved a little bit more in-person work is required for labs and other sorts of manufacturing industry. And so there's, like Kevin said, it's going to take some commitment and creative solutions. And the other thing is, housing, there are groups of people who are advocating in San Francisco for this type of mixed use. I think that is seen as a more resilient form of housing and business, to have retail on the bottom, for example, and housing on the top, to allow residents to go downstairs to go to the grocery store. Those types of developments can tend to feel more community-based. They can also tend to be more sustainable because you're not driving to go to the grocery store. You have transit right outside your door. And so there is a vision of downtown that is a little bit more friendly to different types of companies and different types of people who might want to live, work, and play there.
Thank you. And Sarah, I'd love to stay with you for a moment, and Kevin, jump in on this one as well. I wanted to just turn, since we're talking about some solutions or ideas, in your reporting, you talked a little bit about the LA's adaptive reuse ordinance. So I'm not sure which of you would love to dive into that one, and then the impact of the adaptive reuse ordinance on housing production in LA, which most people think, oh, LA, it's this massive suburban, which it is, but they've done an amazing job on trying to reinvent their downtown.
Yeah, I can kind of jump in on this. So I'm actually from Southern California in LA, and for much of it, and my parents are also grew up there as well. And for much of their sort of life, downtown LA was kind of a dangerous place. It wasn't a place you ever really wanted to go. Now it's incredibly hip. It's vibrant. It has a lot of residential use. And part of that was a kind of concerted effort by the city leadership to pass this adaptive reuse ordinance. And what that did, and it was back in the late 90s, what that did was basically allowed them to take advantage of some of these distressed, empty, vacant, dilapidated buildings and turn them into something what the city really needed, which was new housing for an increased population and citizenry. And over the 2 decades that ordinance was in place, and it did a bunch of things, it relaxed some building standards, which we haven't gone into the big sort of seismic retrofitting conversation. It's not necessarily the sexiest thing to talk about, but it is these sorts of things in the building code that really make it difficult for developers to actually achieve the goal of converting these buildings. But it kind of relaxed some of the standards in that case in fire exit standards and building requirements, seismic retrofitting requirements. And through the use of this ordinance, the city was able to create 14,000 units. And they're actually not stopping there. I think in the next couple of months, the city council is again actually going to look at an update to this. So basically how it works with a lot of these adaptive reuse ordinances, you start to see basically a slow growth in the amount of units converted, a peak, and then it starts to decline as less and less of these candidate buildings are available. So what they're trying to do is actually do an update to the ordinance to actually broaden the number of buildings that are applicable. So opening up the timeline for buildings. So basically doing more recent buildings as candidates for conversions, basically opening up new different building standards and things like that to actually create this next phase and hopefully in the eyes of policymakers continue the really amazing success that Los Angeles has had as really a poster child for these types of projects over the past 2 decades.
Well, and a question for both of you. Do you know from your reporting and conversations with folks, is there any conversation going on with San Francisco thought leaders within housing, downtown conversions, et cetera, to the expertise, if you will, of what LA's been able to do over the last decade plus?
So San Francisco right now is really focused on what it wants to do by itself. I don't know how to put that more gracefully, but Kevin mentioned it earlier. Governor Gavin Newsom said the other day that the state is going to start penalizing cities that aren't doing enough. And meanwhile, San Francisco's policymakers are focusing on things like fourplex legislation, which I don't know if you know what that is, but the idea is to take a state law, actually, that allows for basically all single family zoning to be upzoned to allow for more units and create like a special San Francisco version of this bill. And that's the approach that legislators have been taking to these statewide efforts. Things like removing parking minimums, which we already actually have, because San Francisco likes creating versions of state policy that it says fits its political and sort of goals when it comes to housing. What that ends up sometimes meaning is that these state laws aren't as powerful here in San Francisco. And a lot of that has to do with legislators here wanting to maintain sort of local control over our housing policies and things like discretionary review, because they want housing development to be careful, to be planned. And I honestly haven't asked the folks, especially on the land use committee, about LA's policies in particular, but what I imagine they would say is, oh, but we're San Francisco and we want to do it our own way.
Right. The unicorn of housing, which has been borne out by lack of and more and tens of thousands of folks still wandering the streets, which we've been having the same conversation since I moved here in 1977, sadly. I want to segue back for a second. You mentioned Governor Newsom, and either one of you jump in on this question, but he's trying to put the proverbial funding where he's putting his hammer, right? So he said, hey, in our new budget, here's $100 million in seed funding to convert offices into housing. So do you want to share a little bit about what the policy is, and if you feel like it's hitting any open ears in San Francisco?
Yeah, so he actually boosted that number. I think the current number tagged in the budget is $400 million, and so it's a lot of money. But you got to think he's going to probably, or the state is probably going to incentivize putting that or prioritize putting that money into places where they think are doing housing policy correctly, rather than, like I said, San Francisco being more of a problem child. So the idea would be to basically create grants to help incentivize, to remove cost barriers and help ease conversions, and particularly working on this issue of the downtown conversions. And I think the details are still yet to be worked on what exactly that looks like, whether cities will need to sort of work internally on how to develop their own sort of systems and maybe use that pot of funding for financing help. But I mean, cities around the country are really jumping in on this because they sort of see this collapse in commercial property values coming. Because if you don't really have people in offices, they're not really worth much. And a lot of city budgets are really kind of predicated on that property tax. So you have cities like Washington, D.C. that's thinking of creating sort of a tax abatement program for these conversions. You have cities like Chicago, which is pitching sort of tax credits and incentives and financing to actually make these sorts of things happen. And I'd be a little bit remiss if I didn't mention New York. We talked a little bit about LA's adaptive reuse ordinance. Well, the other major city we can kind of point to as a test case is New York after 9/11, which basically wiped out Lower Manhattan and really depressed that entire part of the city. And the state sort of worked together on financial incentives, regulatory and zoning changes to really incentivize building up Lower Manhattan as a little bit more of a diverse neighborhood. Now you go there, there's restaurants on the waterfront, there is hotels, there's housing there as well. In addition to like the Wall Street offices that we kind of know, and I guess I wouldn't say love, but we at least know. And those sorts of changes added, I think, 25,000 or so units down there. And they're not stopping there. I think they started an adaptive reuse task force. I think they're supposed to report back by the end of the year, figure out some regulatory changes to make it easier, make these sorts of programs and projects easier. So we're a little bit behind the eight ball if this is something that we want to do, because we haven't really convened something specifically focused on this. We're convening task force and blue ribbon commissions and whatever to think about how to build housing. But if we're really want to make a concerted effort on this programs and this effort in particular, I think we're going to need to really kind of shine a light and put a focus on it.
And going back to the state money, I mean, there's a lot more where that comes from. Governor Newsom and the state's housing office are doling out grants. They're giving money to cities who have shown a willingness and an interest in making building happen. And in San Francisco, we've actually started an effort to apply for pro-housing status, which is this new program at the state, which would give certain cities, Sacramento's the only one who's gotten it so far, this designation that they're pro-housing, and that would make them basically put them at the top of the list for grants and subsidies from the state. It's pretty interesting. I reviewed the city's application for this status, and there's a lot of stuff that we can show to prove that we've taken down barriers to building housing, but there's still a lot of work left to do. Like I said earlier, on our permitting processes, our timelines. And so it's really not clear whether the state will take this application seriously and take our pleas for money seriously. But the consequences are pretty big if we're not able to prove, A, that we can meet their goal for the 82,000 units in the next decade, and B, that we are welcoming to housing development generally in the city. Because if we're not able to prove those things, our funding stream more or less could get cut off from the state. And that is a huge, huge threat to our ability to build housing in the future, because the cost is so high and we basically need public dollars anywhere we can get them in order to make this housing happen.
Well, and so staying with the idea of San Francisco actually applying, and I love the fact that Sacramento is going after it, given urban sprawl, if you will. I would love to get each of your input or thoughts on New York, which was what you were talking about, Kevin, and you guys talked about this in your reporting, was the 421A tax abatement program. And since our last episode in part 2, Noah kind of walks the audience through what I think is kind of a cascade of effect where, and you talked about a little bit as well, Kevin, where office space 25% occupied, maybe at best it's 40% or 50%. It comes up for reassessment. They're all going to ask for reassessment. All the buildings get reassessed at lower tax basis. All the tax money that the city is living on goes away. And it seems like a tax abatement program and a adaptive reuse ordinance, those hand in hand could really be amazing tools for San Francisco to reinvent itself. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I think right now we're sort of wanting to, I would call, right size our downtown. So make sure that we have the amount of housing, the amount of commercial space, the amount of retail that makes sense for whatever the post-pandemic future will look like. And because there's a certain inertia that is caused by the amount of investment, the amount of capital that's already gone in, we're going to need some sort of policies to at least put a finger on the scales a little bit to kind of push things in the right direction, whether that's tax abatements. I mean, honestly, whether that's subsidies to help this thing happen. It's kind of interesting. We don't really have this conversation very much anymore, but for much of the 20th century, the federal government put a lot of money into developing public housing. And it's not something that is really existing in our political conversation anymore, but it's something that a lot of folks locally and at the state level and are talking about. Like, we're going to need to think about how to do this on a big scale, because these sort of one-off solutions, these sort of marginal things are not going to really help lead these cities around the country into whatever that next phase needs to be.
Yeah, I want to jump in a little bit because government subsidies can go far in housing. The thing I'm hearing from developers right now, though, is that a tax break on a development is not gonna build it. It's not gonna make the 2 + 2 = 4. And so with rents staying steady or even dropping, and with just the cost of labor rising, the cost of materials rising in San Francisco, the uncertainty of even getting it built. And then we have this other thing, which are impact fees in the city, which developers have told me sometimes actually prevent a project from happening because San Francisco asks for such a high, in their opinion, number of units to be below market rate. So they can't charge market rate rents on up to 25% of the housing they're going to be building on site. And so that kind of thing does beg the question, like Kevin brought up, if there's a public housing, or the new phrase today is social housing option, where government steps in and does more than just tax discounts and actually pioneers its own housing building, especially in the affordability where housing could be specifically for people who make lower incomes and could be capped basically in order to basically allow more people to live in San Francisco who are getting priced out all the time now. And so those are solutions that are definitely on the radar. I think it's going to take a lot more than what San Francisco is currently doing. The flip side of the impact fees, the inclusionary housing rate, is that it does provide affordable housing in the city, and advocates for it say it's still not enough. Even 25% of a new building is not nearly enough to reach our state goals and to just make the cost of rent go down. And so it's going to take setting aside land for specifically affordable housing. It's going to take these sort of bigger sweeping efforts if the city hopes to counteract the simple market forces that are bending rent and the cost of housing a lot higher in line with every other cost we see, gas prices, everything else.
Thank you. I'd love to turn to both of you and ask, how can folks who are listening to the show get engaged in supporting efforts to convert office space to housing or build more affordable housing, help small businesses, etc.? So, Kevin, why don't we begin with you?
Well, a lot of it is the stuff that you've heard before, show up at your local city meetings, right? And get to know your local legislator, whether that is on the city level or the state level, or state legislative level, or the federal level. And a lot of it is education. These things, housing development, housing taxation policy are very complicated. But if you're able to kind of explain it to people in a way that sort of makes sense, and that's kind of what our job is, and that's why we initially set out to write this article, you can kind of get people on board, because I think one of the things that is kind of great about this housing issue is there's a lot of bipartisan support for wanting to address the issue of homelessness, for wanting to make sure people have an affordable place to live. I think if you start from those sorts of very basic understandings of people's right to basically be able to live in the city in which they were raised and born, or they want to work, there's a lot of support for that. Now, how we get there, that's the more complicated question. But for example, there's multiple housing initiatives on the ballot coming up in November. So get educated about that. And in a place like San Francisco, a little bit goes a long way in terms of being able to change public opinion or change the opinion of folks in your community, because it can get very complicated and can get very discouraging. But if we want to make solution, want to make progress on some of these big issues, it's kind of going to need to have everybody rowing in the same direction, starting with that very basic understanding of wanting to have an affordable place to live.
Great. Thank you. And Sarah?
Yeah. So what I do is I show up to city meetings. I'm there as an observer, but there's a lot of people who aren't. And specifically the land use committee, it meets every Monday at 1:30 p.m. and you can tune in remotely. And if you really you see something on the agenda, or you don't even see something on the agenda and you just want to talk about housing, those 3 members of the Board of Supervisors are there to listen to your concerns about land use. And there's also, coming up on November 15th, there's a big hearing at the whole Board of Supervisors on the housing element update. So if you have a vision for what the future of San Francisco should look like, where we should be building housing, how we should be building housing, there will be time for public comment at that meeting. And it's where the city as a whole will be gathering to talk about basically the next 8 years of housing development. So there are opportunities. And like Kevin said, reaching out to your representatives, it sounds like, oh, maybe they won't have time or they won't listen to me, but that's what these people are here for. They represent your neighborhood. They live in your neighborhood. And so reach out, and you don't know what could happen.
Thank you. It's great. And for everyone listening, we are working on an election show, an hour show that would broadcast the last Saturday and Sunday of October and the first Saturday and Sunday of November, to try to do a deep dive into local and state propositions, mind-numbing as that may be. So I'd love to turn to our final question for each of you, and that is, what do you feel like are some of the good things, and I know that's all relative, or positive things that have come out of the pandemic, as if you will, drive to do things like convert office to housing, to get more attention on housing issues, on business issues, etc. So who would like to begin?
I'll go. I live in the Richmond district in San Francisco. And as a result of the pandemic, I see Clement Street. I see my neighborhood coffee shops, my neighborhood fried chicken place, Foghorn, which is amazing. Busy. So busy. I think, yes, maybe people are not going downtown. Maybe they're not going to the office. All of my housemates work from home. And so they go out in their own neighborhood. And it's been really fun to kind of see these small downtowns throughout the city thriving and businesses doing well there, and people kind of walking around at all hours of the day. So I really enjoyed getting to know my neighborhood a lot better.
Thank you. And Kevin?
Yeah, and I think I started out this conversation by talking about how the boom times of the pre-pandemic era sort of papered over some of the challenges and the problems that the city had. And I think now we're being confronted with them, and we have a chance to really come together as a city and try to make progress on them. And I think part of that, and I talk to leaders in downtown all the time, and part of that is figuring out whatever this next chapter of downtown might be, and building the kind of infrastructure that we need to make it a 24-hour or at least a 12-hour community rather than a 9 to 5. I mean, somebody made the point to me the other day that downtown is one of the flattest neighborhoods. Why don't we have bike lane infrastructure? Why don't we have ways to get around that isn't just being stuck in a car trying to get on the Bay Bridge? And I don't think we'd be having those conversations without the pandemic. So if anything good can come out of that and helping build something that is a little bit more equitable, that is a little bit more fair, that is a little bit more positive and vibrant, I'm really holding out hope for that.
Thank you. So I want to thank Sarah and Kevin for sharing your wonderful reporting work on how COVID-19 pandemic is impacting downtown San Francisco and all the numerous issues and potential solutions of converting office space into housing. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, website, and social media, along with links to your reporting, which is always ongoing, and you guys have done an amazing job there, so they can get engaged with the issues as well as the various solutions being proposed and executed by our local government. We hope so. Business and nonprofit organizations, please stay safe and healthy as we all work our way through the latest stage of the COVID-19 pandemic and all of its variants. That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of the housing and transportation reporter at the San Francisco Standard, Sarah Wright, along with small business policy and economic recovery reporter at the San Francisco Standard, Kevin Trong. To read Sarah Wright's reporting on housing and transportation, please go to sfstandard.com/author/Sarah-Wright. And to read Kevin Trunk's reporting on both business and recovery policy, please go to sfstandard.com/author/Kevin-Trung. To hear parts 1 and 2 of our downtown San Francisco stories, please go to georgecoster.com and click on Voices of the Community and click on the COVID-19 series and listen to episode 95, which is part 1, that features the voices of Chris Wright from Advance SF and Jeff Belisario from the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, and episode 98, which is part 2, that features the voices of Noah Arroyo from the San Francisco Chronicle and Anna Tong from the San Francisco Standard. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. Today's episode was made possible by the audio wizard and our associate producer, Eric Estrada, and the graphics magic of Casey Nance from Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is supported by a grant from the James Irvine Foundation, dedicated to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. More at irvine.org. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.